Welcome, my dear brothers and sisters, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 45 today. We're going to finish what we started last week by continuing to talk about geographic expansion during the 19th century. So we left off looking at countries in Asia and specifically finished out with China. So today we're going to pick up with Japan and Korea. During the first half of the 19th century, Japan was entirely closed to all Western contact and influence. In 1854, the U.S. Navy forced Japan to sign their first commercial treaty with a Western power. Soon, Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Russia followed. And this is a pattern we see throughout these nations, that they want to maintain being closed off, but eventually the Western powers worm their way in and force them to go along with what they're wanting. The Japanese responded by acknowledging Western technological superiority and by seeking to learn as much as possible from the West. By the end of the century, Japan had become an industrial and military power. So Japan was smart because they realized, okay, if we're being forced to do something we don't want to do, then there must be something that the forces coming in have that we don't have. And instead of constantly fighting against that, let's try to learn what they have and be able to improve our own technology so that we can rise to be on the same level as them or even surpass them. So it was a smart way of looking at things, and it did serve them very well. The process of rapid westernization aided the work of missionaries who began arriving shortly after the first treaty was signed. And it's interesting, most of the time these missionaries are not going to be for the colonization efforts or the efforts of Western powers forcing these nations to enter into treaties with them. And yet at the same time, it also allows them to come in, and they don't not take advantage of that. They come in, and yet they're not going to be for the reason that they come in. So it's a very complicated issue when you look at it from the outside in. And in some ways, people have tried to simplify it to either make them all good or all bad or however you want to look at that. But in reality, it's very complex. Soon there were churches in all the major cities of the nation, and native leadership emerged. Near Nagasaki, Protestant missionaries found about 100,000 people who still retained what their ancestors had learned earlier from Francis Xavier and other Jesuit missionaries. So Catholicism had come into Japan first. It hadn't really gained much of a foothold, but it did in one small location. And there were a lot of people who retained it. Even if they didn't follow the teachings of Christianity, they knew about them. So those Protestant missionaries came in expecting one thing and found something very different. And they had to kind of change the way they approached that. But it's interesting that there was a lingering effect from missions that had happened way earlier, and people had retained the knowledge that they had brought with them. The Japanese learned from the example of the West, and in 1876 they forced Korea to sign its first commercial treaty. Soon Korea signed similar treaties with the United States, Great Britain, and Russia. So Japan learned very well, and they decided they were going to be throwing their weight around a little bit, and got Korea to have to open themselves to Japan. And once that happened, that opened the door for the rest of these powers to get into Korea. This opened the way for the first Protestant missionaries to Korea. Methodists and Presbyterians from the U.S. arrived in 1884. And again, as the Western powers go in, even though the missionaries are not going to necessarily be for their tactics, they're still going to open the door for them to get in too. And they're going to closely follow. So almost every time, once one of these powers gets in, the door's opened, they're going in. They're going to walk through the door. They're not going to just sit back, and they're going to come in anyway. The churches they established flourished even after the Japanese occupation of 1910 caused difficulties for them. And they did very well there with the churches that they established. Soon, Korea had more Christians per capita than any other Far East nation besides the Philippines. So it was very interesting that they were able to really very strongly evangelize Korea in ways that maybe they were not effective in other of these Asian nations. So let's jump into the Philippines now. The Philippines had been conquered and colonized much earlier by the Spanish, and therefore the beginning of the 19th century Most of the population was Catholic. So another place that had a Catholic influence, but unlike Japan, it was a strong Catholic influence. It wasn't just a small Catholic influence. But the people longed for independence. In 1896, independence was first proclaimed, but it was not achieved until 50 years later. In the meantime, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States following the Spanish-American War. So for a small period of time, the U.S. kind of ran the Philippines the way that the Spanish had. During the struggle against Spain, the Catholic Church served as an instrument against the people. As a result, the Filipino Independent Church was formed. So they kind of got out of the Catholic Church because they looked at them as being on the side of their enemy, the one that was trying to keep them from being independent. And they didn't go and try to find another denomination to join. They just started their own, and it resulted in the Filipino Independent Church. This church was later influenced by Protestantism and moved even further from Catholicism. Protestants entered during the period of American occupation, but by 1914, the number of churches they had founded remained small. So the Protestants didn't really get a lot of ground because the nation was already very highly influenced by Catholicism. Indonesia, originally colonized by the Portuguese, was mostly in Dutch hands by the beginning of the 19th century. The Dutch East India Company, in charge of the colonial enterprise until 1798, had resisted missions. So if you'll remember, we talked about that last week. A lot of these groups that came into these countries, they didn't want missionaries because they thought that it was going to make them, in some way, would make things more difficult for them if they brought in the missionary aspect along with everything else they were dealing with, and they just didn't even want to take the chance. So they didn't care about the people, obviously. They were in it for financial gain, and anything that they thought would even come close to threatening that, they were going to be against it. Therefore, it was mostly during the 19th century that substantial efforts were made to reach the population in Indonesia. English adventurer James Brooke was named Raja of the state of Sarawak. He invited missionaries into his territories. He also encouraged the immigration of Chinese Christians. By the end of the 19th century, Christianity had made great gains in Indonesia. So the efforts by these early missionaries, both from the West and even from China, did go a long way into helping Indonesia to have a good Christian population at that time. Now let's look at Australia and New Zealand. To the east and south of these lands were areas known only vaguely by Europeans since the 16th century, but were brought to the attention of Britain by Captain James Cook between 1768 and 1779. The largest of these lands, Australia and New Zealand, were soon colonized by the British, who established churches in them. So as the British came in, they brought the church with them. Both the Aboriginal inhabitants of Australia and the Maori of New Zealand were decimated by the diseases brought by European immigrants. And we see that certainly in the expansion of Europeans across the globe. They would just bring things that the people they didn't have a natural immunity to. And so they often would bring disease with them that would kill a large number. They didn't do that intentionally, but it was just part of things. Now, they did a lot of bad stuff intentionally, don't get me wrong there. But that was one of the things, it was an unfortunate thing, and wish that it didn't happen, but unfortunately it did. It fell to the churches to protest against the mistreatment and exploitation of these native people. So they certainly did mistreat them as well, and the churches stood up against that. Smaller islands of the Pacific at first drew the interest of adventurers and dreamers, then of missionaries, and finally of imperial powers who entered after 1870. So in the latter part of that 19th century. By the end of the century, virtually every island had been claimed by a foreign power. So all of this area in the east is just going to be taken up by these Western powers as they move through looking to colonize. And they're not going to leave any stone unturned, as we'll see. By then, most of the population of Polynesia were Christian, and there were also churches in almost all of the islands of Melanesia and Micronesia. Only the remotest places, such as the interior of New Guinea, remain unreached for Christ. So again, you look at all of this. Is it good? Is it bad? There's a lot of bad, but one good thing, through the fact that Western groups were going to go through all these places, it opened a door for mission work. Does the ends justify the means? I'm not saying that, but it happened. And nothing anybody could have done to have kept it from happening. It was just the way the world was going to go. Eventually somebody was going to get, some group of people was going to get the ability to travel around the world. And when they did, they were going to try to hit every place they could. And it didn't matter who it was. So does the end justify the means? No. But if the bad's going to be there anyway, at least you can see that there was some good. And the door for missions opened in a large way through these countries coming in, although that's not always the case. And even for those countries that there was a door opened, it was just an open door to get in. Then the missionaries had to work their way in. And the missionaries would often end up in areas very far into these countries amongst people that the conquering nations had no interest in, and they would go to them. So again, they did push through even bad circumstances to proclaim the name of Jesus Christ. Now let's move away from that area, that far east area, and come a little bit closer, still in the east. We're going to look at Africa, the African continent, and throughout the Muslim world. For centuries, Muslim power had blocked European expansion to the south and southeast, but during the course of the 19th century, colonization of these lands began. The efforts of the Muslims to keep the Western world out finally gave way. They couldn't do it forever. They did it for a long time, but it finally gave way, and the Western world comes into the East once again. By the opening of World War I, Great Britain, France, and Italy had control of the north coast of Africa, and the Ottoman Empire was about to disappear. So they're making a lot of ground, a lot of headway. This led many to consider the possibility of beginning mission work in those areas and in other traditionally Muslim lands. If you think about the last time that the Christians had really made a huge effort to get into the Muslim world was during the Crusades. And they weren't going there to evangelize. They were going there to try to take over. Now, there's definitely Western groups coming in that are trying to take over, or at least establish colonies or whatever, get resources. That's happening, but that's governments now. That's not the church. Now Christianity, the Christian world, is coming in to proclaim the name of Jesus Christ. And they're coming in for a whole different reason than the last time they came in. And so it's gonna make a difference this time as they come in, although as we all know, they didn't necessarily make all of the ground that they would have liked to everywhere. However, there were already other Christians in the region. The main issue for Western missionaries was how their work should relate to older churches. So the Eastern Church still existed, and the areas that they're going into now, that's where the ancient church was. The Christians had been there for a long time, but they hadn't followed the tradition of the Christianity in the West. It's going to be a different brand of Christianity. So there are going to be differences. How do you deal with that? They had to figure that out. Roman Catholics sought to bring entire bodies of Eastern Christians into communion with Rome and obedience to the Pope. So their idea was, let's just bring them on in with us. As you can imagine, that wasn't going to go over extremely well all the time. And many groups, while keeping their rites and traditions, did become Roman Catholics known as Uniates. So there definitely were some that came in, but they didn't abandon everything from their Eastern traditions. They kept them. So they were kind of a hybrid of the East and the West. They were Roman Catholic, but they were a different group, and so they had a different name, the Uniates. And they were the group that kept Eastern tradition while moving on to become Western Roman Catholics. Although Roman Catholics sought to convert Muslims, they had little success. Protestants, on the other hand, often sought to cooperate with the ancient Eastern churches, hoping to help bring them about a renewal in the life of those churches. So the Protestant idea was, let's not go in there and try to make them all like us, but at the same time, let's kind of make them like us. So they didn't try to tell them you have to join, the Protestant movement or whatever, or even an individual denomination, but they wanted to come in and bring their traditions and their ways of doing things into the Eastern Church. So a little bit better, I guess, if you look at it, that they weren't telling them you have to change completely, and yet they still weren't accepting them exactly where they were. They wanted to bring different ideas to them and spark a renewal within those churches. So not in any way a negative goal, but again, it's not going to exactly translate to everyone the same way. But this practice led to division within the churches. The conservatives returned to their older practices, and the more progressive became Protestants. So it didn't really work. The conservative groups they weren't going to budge, so they stuck with the Eastern ways. They didn't want to incorporate any of the Protestant thinking. The more progressive group couldn't really survive in that kind of environment, so they had to get out completely, so they just became Protestants. So you ended up with a division either way on both sides. Looking more into this, but Protestants were able to make converts from the Muslim population, particularly in Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon. Those were areas that were very much strongholds of ancient Christianity. And while they didn't maintain that necessarily, there was still the remnants of it there. So the Protestants were able to make some ground up with the Muslims in those areas. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were few European enclaves in Africa. But by 1914, the only independent states of the entire continent were Ethiopia and Liberia. So in a small amount of time, almost the entire African continent got colonized by Europeans. And it's just amazing that they spread that fast. Meanwhile, missionaries were penetrating into areas never before seen by Europeans. They're going even deeper into the continent. Colonies by the British, French, and Germans divided the continent. These events aroused missionary interest in Europe and the United States, and so missionaries came. In general, Catholic missions were most successful in Catholic colonies. That makes sense. While Protestants gained more ground in British and German colonies. No surprise there. The most famous Protestant missionary to Africa was David Livingstone, a native of Scotland. He repeatedly traveled across southern Africa preaching the gospel and working as a doctor. So he definitely was a preacher, but he also brought medical care to people. And this is going into a continent and into countries amongst people that didn't have any modern medicine. So if he didn't get their attention with the preaching, he definitely got their attention with the medical work. Livingstone hoped that people would be converted to Christianity, but also that the horrors of the slave trade would be stopped by opening Africa to legitimate trade. Livingstone saw how the population had been decimated because of the slave trade, and he wanted to put a stop to it. And he thought, if people can see that there's a way of getting some monetary gain out of this nation, but without having to go take slaves, then we could open the door to legitimate trade. It would be beneficial for both sides. And the biggest benefit would be that you wouldn't want to have slaves then, because you would want the people in Africa to stay there and produce the goods that you would want to trade for. So he definitely made a big effort to change the way things were going as far as the slave trade went. His writings did much to arouse interest in Africa in both Scotland and throughout the North Atlantic, and were important factors contributing to abolition of the slave trade. So he made a big, big impact and should certainly be remembered for that. And we should be thankful for a Christian man who lived his convictions and didn't see human flesh as a way to gain material goods in this world and then try to slap the name of God on top of that. It's a ridiculous concept. It's despicable. People like this help to change that. And again, they need to be remembered for that. By 1914, there were Christian churches in almost all of Africa. This was true both in major cities as well as remote villages. So there's going to be a lot of penetration into Africa by the message of Christ. One of the first African-born missionaries, Samuel Crowther, enthusiastically related that the experience of worshiping and preaching in his native tongue was akin to having a dream. So he was very excited about being a missionary to his own people and to be able to preach to them and teach about Jesus Christ and what he had found through a relationship with him. And so that's exciting. But unfortunately, it seems like there's always some bad news to go with the good news. But a long struggle would follow as African leaders emerged who sought equality with foreign-born missionaries. So the African leadership kind of wanted to take care of their own people, and obviously the foreign-born missionaries didn't want to just leave. So there was conflict there, and that took a while to deal with. Now let's turn to Latin America. We spent a lot of time talking about Latin America at the end of the first season, because the Catholic Church came into the colonies that were established there and made a lot of ground. But we're going to see the move of Protestantism into Latin America during the 19th century. Independence in Latin America led to the founding of Protestant churches in every nation. At first, this was the result of immigration. Throughout the 19th century, the governments were convinced that they should encourage immigration from Europe and the United States. And the reason for that is they saw, kind of like what happened in Japan, they saw that there were advantages in those countries because of knowledge that they had and what they were able to accomplish. And they wanted that. So they thought the best way to bring it about was to make it very profitable and desirable for immigrants to come in, and with them would come the Western ideas. And so they made a strong push to encourage people from Europe and the United States to come in as immigrants. Since many of these immigrants were Protestants who would not abandon their faith, many governments issued laws granting freedom of religion to immigrants. Soon they extended these rights to their own citizens. So in most of these countries, it was illegal for you to be anything other than Catholic. There was no freedom of religion. But when the Protestant immigrants came in, that couldn't stay that way because they weren't going to come and abandon their beliefs. And it would have been a huge issue with inviting people to come in and bringing them in. So they just decided, okay, we'll make a law that says that the immigrants can have freedom of religion. Well, it doesn't really make sense. It's unequal for your own people to not have the same rights you're given to the immigrant. So those laws eventually had to change and open the door for these populations to be able to explore Protestantism and other religions for that matter. Since this was the time of North American expansion to the West, fewer immigrants came from the United States. So this is the time where the U.S. is pushing west. And so there's plenty of land, and if you wanted to immigrate, there's plenty of places to go in the continental United States. In North America, you didn't have to go down to Latin America. You could stay where you were and just go further west. And so there wasn't going to be a strong push to immigrate from North America at that period of time. But eventually, of course, that would change, but not initially. Immigration eventually led to missions among native Latin Americans. The first missionary to arrive was probably Scotsman James Thompson, a Baptist representative of the British and Foreign Bible Society. He arrived in Buenos Aires in 1818. Over the next few years, he visited Argentina, Chile, Cuba, and Mexico, then departed for other lands. In Colombia, he founded a Bible society. So he really made the rounds in that country. He had a lot of territory. But it was in the second half of the century that permanent Protestant work began in most South American countries. In 1867, Protestant work began in Buenos Aires. At about the same time, the Presbyterian Church began work in Chile. So it's the latter half of the century that the bulk of the Protestant work is going to begin in these Latin American countries. In general, it was after 1870 that missionary agencies from the United States began taking an active interest in Latin America. So it took that long for the U.S. to start kind of getting in. And, that was the better part of the 19th century. But again, there was a lot going on in the U.S. at that time. So it took a little while, but eventually they did make their presence known. By the time World War I broke out in 1914, there were significant numbers of Protestants in every country in Latin America, both in churches that were the direct result of missions and in others that had been born in Latin America itself. So a huge push by the Protestant church into the Latin American world that had been exclusively Catholic up to that point. So that's kind of a tour through the world. The geographic expansion is a very broad stroke tour, but at least we see some of what was going on. And the big thing we see is there is a huge missionary push during the 19th century, unlike the world had ever known. And as a result of that, we're going to see something begin that's come to be known as the ecumenical movement. So we're going to finish out today by looking just briefly at that. One significant event in the 19th century was the beginning of a truly universal church. By 1914, there were churches in almost every nation on the globe. These churches were beginning to develop their own leadership as well as their own understanding of what it meant to be Christian. This was the birth of the ecumenical movement in two senses. First, the term means pertaining to the entire inhabited earth. Never before had Christianity been so ecumenical as it became in the 19th century. You may be thinking, well, wait a minute, what about the original Christian push? Well, obviously that transformed the world, but it was limited because a lot of the world was not the known world by those people, so they couldn't go into them. They didn't go really too far to the east out of the area they were in. They were in the east, but they didn't go to the Far East. They pushed into Europe, obviously, but they didn't go to North America or to any of these other places that were far away because they didn't even know they existed. So this is a product of a missionary push happening and simultaneously a push by Western civilization to move throughout the globe. And with it came the missionary movements through all these countries in the inhabited earth in a way that had never happened before. Second, if by ecumenical one means that which has to do with the unity of Christians, it is clear that one of the driving forces leading to the modern Christian unity movement was the missionary movement. We've already talked about how these missionaries had to cooperate on the field, and so it's going to begin to change the way these denominations function when it came to missionary work. In the United States, where people of different Christian confessions live next to one another, ecumenical sentiments gain ground as a result of various causes that appeal to people across denominational lines. These include abolitionism, temperance, fundamentalism, liberalism, and there's a bunch of others too. So you might be united with people of different denominations when you care about these causes. We see the same thing today, and even in political terms in some ways, but there's still a lot of division between the denominations. But that can't happen on the mission field. In overseas missions, however, cooperation became mandatory. It soon became apparent that coordination of efforts between missionaries of different denominations would be good stewardship of limited resources. For instance, if a group had already gone into a country and had translated the Bible into that native tongue, you didn't want to then just go as another denomination and do the same work. You needed to share that work. It would be a terrible waste of resources and a lot of time and effort to do the exact same thing somebody else did. But in order to take advantage of that, you had to be willing to work together and cooperate. And so in these ways, as people went to different groups and as different denominational groups were the first to go into different places, they would work together with others that came along. The divisions that would stand up in the Western world on the mission field, they didn't stand up, because there was something more important going on. They were trying to evangelize these people, bring the gospel to people who'd never heard it before, and to maintain these divisions in the midst of that was not going to work, and it didn't happen. Most important of all was the importance of presenting a single interpretation of the gospel to people rather than presenting a number of competing interpretations. So again, there had to be a cooperative effort to do that. The great forerunner of the ecumenical movement was William Carey, who suggested an international missionary conference be convened at Cape Town, South Africa in 1810. So he saw the need for this right away. Remember, William Carey is the father of modern missions, and he saw the need for it. But at this time, Carey's message of unity fell on deaf ears. But 100 years later, his call would be heeded. Meanwhile, many conferences took place on a smaller scale. So people weren't quite ready for it when he first called for it. They still were trying to maintain these divisions. It took 100 years, but finally 100 years later, there was another call for a worldwide effort, a worldwide conference of missionaries to take place, and it did. Finally, in 1910, the First World Missionary Conference gathered in Edinburgh, Scotland. The conference fully achieved its basic goal of exchanging information and plans, but its significance was far greater. This conference, which included participants from various denominations, paved the way for similar meetings in which subjects other than missions would be discussed. So we'll get into more of that later on as we see a unity throughout Christianity in the world be pushed forth through the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, and exactly what effect that's going to have on the church. But we'll get into that later on. We're going to stop right here, though, for today. Next week, we're going to jump back into looking at some things about Catholicism at this time. So we'll do that next week and continue on our study of the history of Christianity.